Hello and welcome to this AGO PipeTalk conversation. I'm here with Dr. Jeremy Filzel, organist and director of music at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, Stephen Tharp, artist in residence at St. James, Madison Avenue, New York City, and David Gammy, musicologist and organist at Sacred Heart Church in Wimbledon in southwest London. All three are fantastic organists, concert performers, and who have made wonderful contributions to our field. Today we, in particular, will be talking about Marcel Dupré and Jeanne Demessieux, particularly in the anniversary years, Marcel Dupré's 50th anniversary of his death, and the 100th anniversary, the centennial of Jeanne Demessieux's birth. We'll dive right in and begin with you, Jeremy. Let me ask you, what drew you to research and record and perform the complete works of Marcel Dupré?
Some people might think I'm mad, but it's been a fantastic journey that's formed much of my or has been a soundtrack to much of my professional life, if not all of it. I was inspired originally as a choir boy, and my choir master played the B major prelude after a Eucharist when I just started learning the organ at the age of 11, and he played the B major prelude, by which I was struck, and stopped at the end of the prelude, and I said, well, there's a fugue to come, is there not? And he said, oh, that's far too difficult, I can't play the fugue. And so I had in that one moment an inkling of perhaps Dupré's vivacity and brilliance, but also the fact that it was rather difficult. But thereafter, I've always been fascinated with Dupré's music, and I've got to know a number of people along the way who had a lot of involvement with either Dupré himself or with his music subsequent to his death. Graham Steed, the Anglo-Canadian organist, being one of them. And with this journey through certainly the last 25 years, David has been a part of that, because the first time I played all the Dupré works, David did all the musicological research and provided the fantastic booklet, which we have to some degree recreated for this current Dupré series. But I've just always been fascinated with Dupré's music. I found it such a wonderful sort of labyrinth to traverse over many years. It's a wonderful opportunity in the 50th anniversary of his death to revisit all these works, some of which I've not played for 20 years. And it's an incredible body of work that is just as fascinating this time around as it was the first time I did it 23 years ago, in fact. And a wonderful silver lining to the cloud of the pandemic, really, because we've been able to webcast the Dupré concerts from St. Thomas due to our extraordinary webcasting facility. And the early concerts in the year, of course, had no audience beyond those online. So we've been able to do it despite the pandemic restrictions. So that's how it came about. It's just been a journey that I've made over many, many years.
Oh, wonderful. Well, and I wonder, having played the complete works and recorded the complete works, is there a composition to you that stands out as something that perhaps encapsulates Dupré's harmonic language? I know it's like picking one's favorite child, but is there something that stands out to you?
Well, it's very difficult because I think Dupré was such a chameleon and a magpie. I mean, you can find works amongst the Oeuvre that are very forward-looking and reflect perhaps the territory of Messiaen, sometimes Stravinsky in the Second Symphony. But each time there was a sort of major advance in harmonic language or structural organization. He goes backwards then to a very conservative reactionary little set of Gregorian preludes. We look at Vision, Opus 44, followed by Opus 45, the short Gregorian preludes, and they couldn't be more contrasted. So it's very difficult to see a journey, a stylistic journey through Dupré's work, and thus very difficult, I think, to identify any one particular piece that really encapsulates his music or his language. I think everything has this strong strand of contrapuntal organization, of course, and that goes back to his reverence for Bach, of course, and that body of music. But I think, if anything, one would identify with the ambitious music, and I would say that Second Symphony is quite an Everest in the works, because it is as a kind of avant-garde in both structure and rhythmic organization as he possibly became, and it has an extraordinarily fresh kind of vision of musical language for the organ. And then I would say, if you want something else that's far more programmatic, the Evocation Symphony, of which the last movement is often played, but it's a cyclic creation, and if one makes that kind of symphonic journey through it, it makes many traversals emotionally and musically, and given its wartime references, but yet all the beauty of the melodical and harmonic color in the middle movement, and the symphonic cyclic organization from the first movement. I think there's so much in that piece that represents his ambition and the beauty of what he did contrapuntally and harmonically. Evocation is a touchstone for me as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, David, in the program booklet and the liner notes that you wrote, you said of the three preludes and fugues, which may be some of the most often played works of Dupré, that they actually remained on the shelf for 8 years after he wrote them in 1912. And that Dupré himself was probably the only organist in France with a technique to play them, and that it's difficult to overestimate their originality, which I think is fascinating to sort of think about at the kind of 100-year mark of those compositions and publications. Perhaps this is a nice way to sort of segment into talking about Dupré as a concert artist, and particularly the tours in which he traveled to America. David and Jeremy, would you elaborate a bit about?
Well, of course, yes, of course. A lot of his music, particularly in the early years, he wrote for himself, like those preludes and fugues. He said that he wrote them while Vidor was making him study composition for the Prix de Rome, and Dupré was going mad with this serious compositional study. So during the summer, he just did something for himself, and a lot of the music that he wrote in succeeding years was written for these tours. And these, of course, are now the works that are quite well known. Those preludes and fugues, which I guess everybody who can play them tries to. The variations on the Noel, of course, written for an audience to enjoy. And then, of course, that wonderful Passion Symphony. That was one of the first pieces of Dupré that really got me excited. Those wonderful pounding chords in the first movement. I've never heard anything like it. Just the sheer vital energy of this music, which the sort of vital life force running through it. So exciting. And then on the other side of this old LP by Graham Steed was the Second Symphony that Jeremy's just been talking about, which I'm working on at the moment. And it's just so exciting. It's life affirming. It strikes me as really a jazz symphony. So certainly there's little bits of Stravinsky. There's a lot of Prokofiev. The second movement is like a little Prokofiev ballet piece. Extraordinary. And to my ears, there's a lot of Gershwin in it as well, which is so exciting. But then alongside these concert works that he essentially wrote for himself, we have the teaching works, which are generally in a much more, as Jeremy said, in a much more conservative idiom. And really, you would never know that they were written by the same person. And indeed, I think that Dupré, as Jeremy said, he's a chameleon, even within one work. like particularly what I think is his masterpiece, the Chemin de la Croix, where the 14 movements, such an extraordinary variety of styles. One or two of them are tonally very strange, and it takes quite a while to come to terms with them. But then others are just completely diatonic, no sort of wrong notes at all. And then the last movement of the Chemin de la Croix, which I think was very, very special to Dupré. And curiously, that was the first piece of his that I ever heard way back in the 1960s when I was a schoolboy. And the school organist used to play the 14th Station of the Cross during Lent every year. And I remember going into the chapel and hearing on the third page this wonderful phrase soars up over the music. And this phrase haunted my teenage years. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the Stations of the Cross were, and I'd never heard of Dupré, but this absolute haunting phrase. And I came across a rather lovely story in Jeanne Demessieux's diaries recently, where Demessieux was at Dupré's home in Meudon, and they sat round the dining room table to listen to a broadcast that he had recorded the previous day, including 4 of the Stations of the Cross. And when he got to that moment in the 14th station, she said Dupré took off his glasses and rubbed his knuckles in his eyes and stifled a sob. But no, I mean, he had no particular problems at that time, but it was just, he was always very deeply affected by that music.
What's interesting, I ought to just say about that moment about which you're speaking. Of course, 1947, Duruflé wrote the Requiem, which, of course, famously, Duruflé was never particularly pleased with anything he'd created, and apparently took the score of much of the Requiem to Dupré and said, "This is not really of any particular value or interest. I'm thinking of, putting it to bed." And Dupré was hugely encouraging of Duruflé and said, "This is a magnificent piece. You must carry on." And what is interesting is that the exact harmonic sequence that Dupré came up with at the end of that 14th station is recreated identically, interval by interval, at the beginning of Duruflé's In Paradisum, which is, of course, 12 years later. So I just wonder whether that little quotation in the In Paradisum is just a doffing of the cap of Duruflé to Dupré. It's an identical moment and with an identical sentiment, the gates of paradise opening. And that happens both those movements.
Because they were very good friends, I think, Dupré and Duruflé. And I've had to do some writing about Duruflé recently, and there are some similarities because I find them both extraordinarily enigmatic characters. They wrote this beautiful music, Dupré a lot of it, Duruflé very little, but you constantly ask yourself, where did this music come from? Because they were, I was going to say they were not terribly interesting people, but that's unfair perhaps. But composers like Vienne and Tournemire, who had such strong personalities, and what one reading about them, reading what they wrote, listening to their music, learning about their lives, it all makes a consistent whole. But with Duruflé and Dupré, this extraordinary music comes. Where does it come from? I ask myself.
But Duruflé, of course, he would often sub in, deputize for Dupré when he was away on his American tours. And in the 1920s, I mean, it's worth saying perhaps that for a number of those early tours, the voracious appetite for Dupré's playing meant that he was away for up to 6 months of those early years of the 1920s, traveling by train, of course, between all these different cities, playing an extraordinary number of concerts. And it's always struck me, of course, that like Rachmaninoff, there was this huge demand for live music just before the advent of the gramophone, when live music was really the only way you heard these people. And both Rachmaninoff, of course, and Dupré, as perhaps the premier organist and pianist of their generation, became very wealthy men as a result of those American dollars. Which, of course, houses that they owned and the music salles that they inhabited.
Which enabled Dupré to build his own concert hall.
Right.
And extraordinary, really. Well, all the other organists in Paris were living in apartments and worrying about money the whole time.
Yeah.
Dupré lived in what Jeanne Demessieux, for the first time she went there, she said, he lives in a palace.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
Well, David, now that you've mentioned Demessieux, it might be a really lovely moment to bring Stephen Tharp into the conversation. Stephen, you are performing the complete works of Demessieux again in New York. You've done it already in 2010 at St. John the Divine, which of course is the place that inspired the writing of her Te Deum. Would you tell us a little bit about what you've discovered about her as a composer and organist while you prepared these recitals and also recorded her complete works in France?
Sure. These are comments I've made before in discussing a lot of this, and the rift that eventually happened between Dupré and Demessieux, I think left her pretty overshadowed by not only Dupré but many others. She would play and eventually teach all over the world and in one way or another, but then couldn't get a job in France thanks to Dupré. And so a lot of her music that isn't amongst the party pieces. That there's the chorale preludes, which are very useful in a lot of contexts. There's the Te Deum, of course. There are the Six Etudes, probably more infamous than famous pieces because of their difficulty, and that she was, in her mid to late 20s when she wrote and was able to play them herself. But there's a lot of her music that has been so neglected, not because it's warmed over, or as one person tried to insinuate, leftover Dupré, which I think is completely unfair. The originality in her own voice was becoming more and more apparent towards the end of her life, when you could see in her later music, the other réponse, the response for the time of Easter was published in her lifetime, but then there are these other works that were not, and Nativité and a few other things where the textures became very different than her earlier works, and the registration concepts influenced by other outside forces, including Messiaen, were becoming much more original. And because she died so young, I don't think she had the chance to fulfill where her language might have gone. And what's interesting in living with this music is discovering the complexity of not just all the semantic sort of elements in what was changing, but whatever had happened and formed her life, whatever impact the rift with Dupré had, there must have been a lot going on inside this lady's head, because there is the psychological weight behind so much of this music. You see it already in the Meditation for the Holy Spirit. And this is thick thought that's happening here. And the more I've been living with music, the more apparent it's become that there's so much from either subconscious or whatever kind of words you want to use, that was influencing where it's coming from. Certainly the contrapuntal tricks and guises that one could compare to Dupré make it, first of all, an obvious comparison, and those things are on the surface and they're very apparent as you study these pieces. But what's going on under all of this, as you live with the music more, just runs deeper and deeper the more I'm living with it. And that hasn't been something the general music world or organ world has had a lot of time to discover until fairly recently, when not only has the rest of this music been published, but more and more people are playing her works. I mean, I feel very lucky to have mastered, to say mastered is a loose term because you live with these pieces for decades. I haven't lived with all of these pieces for decades, but to be able to tackle the music maybe is a better term, and certainly do it. But I'm far from the only one. I'm not the only person to have recorded all of the works, for example. So that this is breaking some ice should just pave the way to more and more people trying to discover more and more of what had been really neglected, simply because I think it got pushed on the back burner by politics and circumstances and other things at that time.
I think a lot of this music, whether it's Demessieux or it's Dupré, is neglected because it requires a huge investment on one's part, not just technically, but I think intellectually. A lot of this music is demanding in every way.
Yeah.
It is not for the faint-hearted,
No.
and it's not. It doesn't fall on the ear particularly easily. I always think that Dupré invites you. I always use the word labyrinthine. It invites you into this pretty dense thicket, and it's really down to you to sort out the inner lines and the opaque structures sometimes, and the dense harmony. And Demessieux is very much in that same ballpark.
Absolutely.
And it does need that time, and it's not it isn't everybody's cup of tea, certainly.
Yeah,
But it's really important music. It's just important music, all of it.
Absolutely.
We have to admit, I think, and these that they both have their anniversaries this year, but they're never going, for the reasons Jeremy just said. Perhaps they will never be as popular as composers like, for instance, Vienne, or indeed Messiaen, much of whose music is quite difficult, but there's a way into it. Even though some of it is very mathematical, but even so, there's a way into it that you have to work at, I think, with a lot of Dupré and with Demessieux, of whom, of course, Dupré said, your music is too advanced for the public. They're not going to understand it. But it's so beautiful if you make the effort. But I think Stephen's being too modest when he says he's lucky to have mastered these works. It's talent and incredible amounts of hard work. That's how you've done it.
Oh, and Jeremy, I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this too. And I don't play every single note that Dupré wrote, but I have played a lot. And I think it's fair to say that, no, this isn't music that necessarily just sticks with you and lays under your fingers just because you played it for a long time. The way with maybe even say Duraflé, the right fingerings 30 years ago, and you can sit down in a reasonable amount of time and something was left in a footprint that you can step back into. And
Yeah.
I can tell you with Demessieux, that is absolutely not the case.
Right.
And not just with etudes. And I think you'd agree that with Dupré, you can say the same depending on what work you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, it's been an interesting exercise for me to revisit the complete works this year, and I found a number of the pieces that I haven't really played over the last few decades have locked back in far more quickly than I thought. I.e., they have left a footprint somewhere or a thumbprint on my forehead. So one or the other, I don't know. But it's been fascinating getting back inside the forest, I have to say. In these pandemic and distracted times, that has been quite a strong element of solace for me. I don't know if it's not for anybody else, but for me.
Right.
Well, we've touched a bit on legacy of both of these incredible organists and their legacies as concert artists, as well as Parisian church organists and as teachers. Obviously, Dupré having a longer tenure as a professor, perhaps. But I wonder now if we could pivot and talk a bit, Jeremy, about the upcoming concerts that we've already mentioned a bit as we've gone along. Would you tell us a little bit about the special connection of Dupré's having been to St. Thomas, and also the upcoming series that we have?
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, it's been wonderful to be able to present this series at St. Thomas on the new Miller Scott Dobson organ, which wants for no color. I mean, anything you require is there. It is an embarrassment de riche, without a doubt. We're halfway through, well over halfway through. Well, I know we're actually on Saturday, this Saturday. Actually, this is going out on a later date, isn't it? We will be halfway through this Dupré Demessieux series, because in the fall we'll pick up where we've left off, hopefully with more audience allowed in the building itself. And on 3 Saturdays in September, the 18th, the 25th. Is that right? Should get my dates right, shouldn't I? Yes, the 18th, the 25th, and the 2nd of October are the final three Dupré concerts, which do include the Symphonie Passion, the Version sur Noël, the Deuxième Symphony, and a lot of other delectable delights. 3 Saturdays in September, and then the 1st in October. And then we have a few weeks breather before Stephen adorns us with the Demessieux series on November the 6th, November the 13th, and November the 20th. So it's going to be an incredible fall series, I think. Particularly wonderful to have audience in the space, because that's something we've really lacked. St. Thomas was a venue where Dupré, of course, famously recorded in 1957. And that was a result of the Mercury Living Presence company wanting to record Dupré while he was on what was a late tour to the States to inaugurate the organ in the Ford Auditorium in Detroit. At the invitation of Paul Paré, who was the conductor of the Detroit Symphony at the time, and who coincidentally was a childhood friend of Dupré's from Normandy years. They famously played together as children and grew up to be fine musicians in their own right. Dupré inaugurated the organ in the Ford Auditorium, the then new Ford Auditorium, Airey and Skinner. They recorded the Saint-Saëns Third Symphony and Paré's ambitious mass. And the engineers were so disillusioned with the dreadful acoustics there, they said, we're not going to record Dupré and his solo albums there. And at the time, Bill Self was called up, just having had the then new Airey and Skinner organ finished in St. Thomas, just the previous year, in fact, 1956, when G. Donald Harrison died just before finishing the instrument tonally. And they shipped the sessions to New York. So Dupré came and recorded the Franck Chorales, Vidors, famously the triptyque of his own, the G minor prelude, and other assorted things. And we have these very vibrant recordings from St. Thomas on what was the then new Airey and Skinner organ. It has changed again, of course, in the subsequent years. And we don't have that instrument any longer. But it's just nice to have. We still have the programs that Dupré played in the building, and of course the recordings have just been reissued on remastered CDs in the last couple of years, and so those are still very much with us and a reminder of that mid-century time when Dupré was active here in the United States. So it's a nice connection to be here at St. Thomas and playing these works within that kind of context.
Absolutely, and it's also incredible to see there's a hand-scripted letter from Dupré to Mr. Arendts about his experience playing and recording there. So lots of history and lots of new music and new history being made as well. Well, our time has really flown by, but it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with all three of you, Jeremy Filzell, Stephen Tharp, and David Gammy. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us and listening to this Pipe Talk from the AGO Organ Fest 2021. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.